Good evening. Good evening and greetings to all those watching and participating in this webinar. We are delighted to present the inaugural webinar of Shuddhashar FreeVoice. Our discussion today centers around the topic of Denmark's blasphemy law, which touches on critical issues such as human rights, freedom of speech and thought, and democracy across the globe. Blasphemy is a pervasive issue that in various forms affects us all. And unfortunately, it is also the reason why Shuddhashar FreeVoice is forced to exist in exile. We firmly believe that open ideas, discussion can inspire the new perspectives, the fresh ideas, and the foster a sense of humanistic responsibility. Today's webinar will be moderated by Dr. Lisa Knight, the co-director and editor of Shuddhashar FreeVoice, and the chair of the Department of Anthropology at Furman University, USA. Lisa will introduce the panelists and provide the guidance for the audience. So welcome to our first webinar. Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. And I need to correct you, Tutul. That was maybe good evening for some of you in some parts of the world, but for us
I'm
over
from
here,
Norway.
It's barely noon. So, but greetings everyone. And it is a pleasure to welcome all of you here. As Tutul said, my name is Lisa Knight, and I'm professor of religions of South Asia here at Furman University, and which is in Greenville, South Carolina. We are just getting fall, but it's still almost summer here. I'm editor also of the Shuddhashar FreeVoice, and I've been part of this organization and platform and magazine since about 2018, when I began doing some research on exiled secular Bangladeshis. So I have the pleasure of introducing our event today. I want to start by asking a question. What should a government do when a small number of citizens perform a lawfully permitted act? An action inspired by hate, no doubt, that has an outsized impact on diplomatic relations and risks the safety and well-being of citizens. In January 2023, a Danish-Swedish far-right agitator staged a Qur'an burning in Sweden. It wasn't his first, but this time it incited protests and demonstrations in Muslim-majority nations and a sharp rebuke from Turkish President Erdogan, who threatened to block Sweden from joining NATO. More Qur'an burnings followed in Sweden and in Denmark. In Iraq, hundreds of people stormed the Swedish embassy in Baghdad and set parts of it on fire. Sweden raised its terrorism threat to high, the second most severe designation, stating that the security situation was the most serious since World War II. The events around the Qur'an burning have put these Nordic countries in a quandary. Scandinavian countries are widely known for their freedom of speech laws. They defend the right to criticize. They defend the right to express freely. They are also secular nations, and most of them have ended their blasphemy laws, though Denmark ended it only 5 years ago in 2017. So these Qur'an burnings in Sweden and in Denmark were therefore legally sanctioned. The instigators had applied for and received permission to do so. There's no doubt that these actions by a handful of right-wing nationalists were motivated by hatred against Muslims and immigrants. The small but frequent protests that they staged specifically denounced Islam and Muslim immigration. So on September 1st, 2023, the Danish government presented a bill that would criminalize the burning of sacred texts in public. The bill prohibits the improper treatment of objects of significant religious significance to a religious community. And a convicted perpetrator could be punished with a fine or imprisonment for up to 2 years. If approved by Parliament, the new policy could be enacted as soon as the end of this year. You can read about Shuddhashar's FreeVoice's own position on this issue in our website, but I wish to make a very brief comment here about why this subject matters to us. As publishers and writers, we consider the burning of any book to be despicable and anti-democratic. And of course, we do. Additionally, with roots in Bangladesh, Shuddhashar has personally experienced the dangers of blasphemy laws, laws that are used to terrorize, censor, and consolidate power while crushing dissent. This subject is therefore very personal. So positioned as we are between the blasphemy laws in Bangladesh and the free speech values of Nordic countries where most of us live, the editorial board of Shuddhashar FreeVoice is particularly invested in these questions. So I turn now to introduce and welcome our panelists. And first, a word to our audience. Our panelists will discuss for approximately 40 minutes, and then we will take audience questions. On your Facebook screen, you will see a box where you can submit questions at any time during this program. And I have to regret to share first that Iqtishad Ahmed, a valued member of Shuddhashar FreeVoice's editorial board, who planned to be part of this program, has had an emergency that prevented him from attending today. But I welcome our other two panelists here. I'll begin with Ulf Gustafsson. He is Association Secretary and Board Member of Humanist Sweden, a member organization of Humanists International, which is a life stance organization for non-religious people, promoting ethics, human rights, and democracy. Also, Patti Tamara Lenard is Professor of Applied Ethics at the University of Ottawa. She runs a community organization in Ottawa called Rainbow Haven, which sponsors, settles, and advocates for LGBTQI refugees and asylum seekers. So welcome to our panel. We're very interested in hearing your take on these complex issues. And I'll start us off with a question. And this is for any of you. If you could begin by describing some of what you see as the underlying societal or political problems that have led to the Qur'an burnings in Sweden and in Denmark.
So hello, everybody. From the Swedish perspective, it's an immigration issue to start with, but it's impossible to connect it with, disconnect it with international politics because of our immigrant community are so well involved in political issues in their home countries. So when a question like this becomes big, it's often because of both international pressure and the situation in Sweden. For instance, when the Danish-Swedish politician Rasmus Paludan burned Qur'an in the spring of 2022, there was no international reaction, really. And then the question was not really raised on a political level in Sweden. But it was rather harsh demonstrations in Sweden and a lot of violence against police in Sweden during that time. But there was not really any more political response more than that they want to support the police and protect the police from anti-demonstrants. But then as well, we must remember that those that make these manifestations with Quran burnings do it because they are anti-immigration from Muslim countries. And they have found out that this is a form of manifestation that gets them a lot of attention. They are really small parties and maybe just a handful active members. And they get, in Sweden, I think it was about 2,000 votes Rasmus Paludan got in the election last year. So they have a really small support in the population. But they can get, this is like the only way they can get attention from media and the broader audience is by making manifestations of this kind and provoking a response. So that is like a very mixed picture from my point of view.
Do you think that they are tapping into, I mean, you say this is a very small group of people who are protesting and making a very, very big stance that's gotten so public. Do you think that they are tapping into a wider spread sentiment in Sweden and Denmark? Is that one thing that might be going on as well?
Yes, they are, but they are, in some way, they are riding of this wave of anti-Muslim sentiments in the society, but they are not really representing it. Because it's like we have this Sweden Democratic Party in Sweden that have about 20% of the votes. They propose anti-Muslim legislation and are quite harsh in their rhetoric regarding Islam and Muslims. But they don't lose any votes. Maybe they even gain votes by these manifestations. So that's like these few people that do it, they help these parties more. But it's difficult to see that they are like promoted from these parties or the wider audience. It's like more like this, they are very singular individuals with a very small connection to the broader society. And if you look at Sweden, at this group, these two men that are from Iraq that have burned the Quran in several times through the summertime, one of those don't speak Swedish. He has been here for 5 years, but he don't have permanent residency. So it's like very, for him, I think it's more like taking the conflict he had in when he was living in Iraq and now moved it to Sweden. So in that way, it's the broader anti-Muslim sentiments are there and should not be denied, but I'm not sure that they are really riding on it, these that are doing this manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not from the Nordic countries, obviously. I come from Canada. I also hold American citizenship. But I do, so when I look at these, I mean, I'm looking at these questions from across the ocean. And it looks to me like there's, I mean, you know, there's sort of a big trend across many European countries to have conversations about what kinds of speech should be permitted in democratic countries, what kinds of speech should be restricted in democratic countries, and when how we should respond when I mean, I'm less comfortable than you, Ulf, to use the language of sort of right-wing provocateurs here in to describe the set of people who are doing this. But there's a set of people who are sort of interested in having a conversation or provoking a conversation about what can be said in public space, right? So if you look back to the Danish cartoon controversy in 2005, which was you know, followed the sort of let's call it the hullabaloo around Salman Rushdie, you know, several years earlier about, you know, the publication of his book. And so it's sort of part of these general conversations about how we should have conversations in democratic public space and what kinds of people should be allowed in, what kinds of things should be considered to be free speech, what kinds of things should definitely be excluded, who should be silenced, who should be welcomed in. And so, I mean, I guess I don't as much as you do, Ulf, see this as a product of immigration from Muslim countries and the response to Muslim countries, as I do about how we can have democratic conversations more generally, which are inclusive rather than exclusive. Just a different perspective.
Yes, that's of course correct. But in the same way, it's not the persons that do this in Sweden and Denmark, they say they are doing this for they are promoting free speech. But actually they have another agenda that are their main agenda. They use more this freedom of speech topic to get sympathy for a broader public audience. You don't see like the real freedom of speech advocates in Sweden, and there are many of them trying to do this type of manifestations.
Okay. So what makes somebody a real freedom of speech advocate as opposed to the Qur'an burners?
I don't think about that organization that are protecting like writers' right to freedom of speech, and liberals that promote this very broad interpretation of freedom of speech. These are not the persons that do this. There are politicians that are anti-Muslim integration, and they're trying to provoke the Muslim population with these acts.
Can I interpret what you're saying to be a defense of banning book burning? Is that the conclusion of what you're saying?
Not really, but I'm trying to say that it's like we must see what type of, there is very few persons doing this, and we can't interpret their actions in a broader sense how easy, because we don't see any support for the actions. It's like a massive support from the Sweden. Everybody takes a stance against books burning in Sweden. That are saying, and then so they have no support. The two persons from Iraq in Sweden have burned the Quran. They have been now rejected to be members in 2 different Swedish parties, and just being members of the parties, because it was known that they were members of the parties. They was not active, not representing these parties. And that is also like a quite harsh stance against people that you're not allowed to be a member of our party because you did this.
No, Ulf, this is so interesting to me. We obviously come at this from quite different perspectives, right? So when I think about this, what I think about is, what do we do in a democratic society when people want to express themselves in public for political purposes? That's the question that I have. And you're answering these questions by saying, look, here's what these people are doing, right? They have all the other motives. They come from these parties. They're trying to do these things. They've got external conflicts that they're trying to bring to Sweden or to Denmark. And what I think is we need to have a more general conversation about what's in and what's out of the democratic political space, and then apply the general answers that we have discovered, that we've unpacked, that we're prepared to defend to the specific cases, right? So in my case, I'm pretty in favor of the view that people should be allowed to express themselves in public spaces so long as the views that they express are not hateful towards others and they don't incite violence towards others. So if that's my principle, which it is, then I think we just let book burners go ahead, right? They have all kinds of things going on. You've said yourself that they're not representative of a more general population. They've got a different objective in mind, but it seems to me that their actions should be protected by freedom of speech laws in your country, in Denmark, in my country, and certainly in the United States, where the burning of everything is definitely defended in terms of freedom of speech, flags all the way to whatever you want to burn. So for me, when I look at the blasphemy law in Denmark that has been proposed, I look at it as a violation of freedom of speech, and that ought to be protected, even though the guys who are doing this, I don't like them. they're doing things that I don't think are appropriate, that I don't think are welcome in a democratic space. But I think that a democratic space has to leave room for conversations with people that you don't like these guys.
So
yeah, I totally agree with that. So,
and I totally agree. Also, from coming here in the US, where we're having all kinds of issues with communicating across differences, right? I mean, it's in the news all the time about how we keep stifling each other or censoring each other, so we're in a very, very polarized moment in our history as well. But I wonder, Patti, one thing that you mentioned in terms of, it sounded like you would advocate for something along the lines of being opposed to hate speech, right? Or being opposed to acts of hate. And would this not fall into that umbrella, so that it's not necessarily about blasphemy per se, but would it also be instead about hate?
Thanks, Lisa. I love that question. And I think that it's actually, I say to my students always, PhD theses are written on the exact line between speech and hate speech, right? So it's a blurry line. It's fuzzy. It would be, you'd have to engage in sort of a lot of, well, I'm a philosopher by training and in my heart. So a lot of sort of, philosophical analysis to try to sort of narrow down a definition. But I think more generally, is that these actions aren't so first of all, there's the question of what the people are doing, and then there's the question of the blasphemy law in particular, right? And so I think that the blasphemy law, as it's written, I don't read Danish and I've only seen news reports, but as it appears to be written, appears to be straightforwardly a violation of freedom of speech. It's saying you cannot burn any sacred texts. It doesn't want to single out Islam as having particular texts that can't be burnt. It wants to say that nobody can burn in public religious texts. And that, written neutrally, that's clearly is something that should be permitted in democratic space. You shouldn't do it. People shouldn't do it. I mean, it's mean. It's mean-hearted. It's silly. But it is part of democratic society to be able to accept ridicule based on your religious practices, right? I mean, there's all, Christians are sometimes, don't see it as much, but because they're sort of, at least in the West, a dominant majority. So every time somebody makes fun of Jesus, people, there's certain sort of highly religious people who are objecting, but mostly we're just like okay when people make fun of Jesus, and we're okay when people make fun of, various elements of the Catholic tradition. People in my circle sometimes make fun of the holy toast that people put on their tongues as part of Catholic communion, right? And we're just used to that. It's part of democratic conversations to be able to make fun of other people's religions. It for those people who are faithful, that sucks. There's technical words for that. It's hurtful, it's disrespectful, but it doesn't feel good, but it's part of it, right? And so the blasphemy laws are straightforwardly opposed to the history of democratic thought, which is in the direction of allowing for and enabling even the ridicule of religions in general. Right, so that I'm quite firmly committed to that. Are the individual people engaged in hate acts when they do it? That I think is a different question, but I don't think it's the one that is answered with the blasphemy law. Like the blasphemy law is just straightforwardly anti-democratic, and then are these people engaging in hate? Maybe, but some of that is going to be determined by the context in which they burn the Qur'an. I can go on, but that's the sort of I think that these are like, whether or not these individual people are engaging in hate speech is a separate sort of political conversation which law enforcement agencies in Sweden and Denmark respectively need to assess. But as written, as just a general rule, burning of religious texts should be permitted.
And Ulf, there was a case in Sweden, wasn't there, of one of the Quran burners being convicted, or they tried to convict him against with hate speech. But I don't think that went through.
Everybody that has burned the Quran the last 2 years have been reported for hate crime, but there has been no, they're not gone to trial so far. So they are under investigation. there have been one trial that should be reported here later in October, and that was a special, different situation. It was a person that burned the Qur'an actually outside a big church on a barbecue with bacon, and he had signs about how he didn't like the Prophet Muhammad and things like that. And he recorded everything that. And then he left also on the recording the burnt Quran outside a mosque. And then he posted this video on YouTube. But I think the most hateful thing he does in this video is that he plays the same music that the terrorist in Christchurch used when he did the attack in New Zealand, when was it about 60 Muslims or 50 Muslims was killed. So I think that is very specific, and as Patti say, you have to put in the circumstances in which the Quran burnings are done.
So Ulf, since you're the Sweden expert on the call, what and I think we were all agreed here. I mean, we're part of an organization called FreeVoice, so
Yes.
we're all in favor of free voices. So I think that we all agree that there is a problem here. There's a real problem. There's anti-Islamophobic sentiment across many of our countries, and one way to deal with this is sort of not to use blasphemy laws. What else? Like, I'm curious what you think. What other kinds of, or do you think there are other kinds of legislative instruments that the Swedish government has which it could deploy to sort of deal with the problems here?
We have this hate speech law in Sweden, but it's quite fuzzy in the borders, and it also depends on the situation. It has been, for instance, if you are a politicians and say something when you are in your act of doing the politics, then you can say more things than you can do actually out in the public street. So it's a little difficult to understand how it should be interpreted. But I say before this year, I think most Swedish people thought that it was more like a problem with this law, that it was too harsh. But today, I think that's have turned, and maybe there are a majority that think it could be more severe or more restrictive. But so that is a way, but I think the major thing you can do actually is to try to change the sentiments in our society. In Sweden, it's like the major problem is that we have a party that has 20% of the votes that are actively focusing on Muslims as a problem in our society. And they want to ban Muslim schools, and they want to ban prayer calls from mosques and things like that. So they are, and they of course get votes for this type of suggestions that, as it looks now, will not be making into law in Sweden, because they have too small support, and you can't make laws just looking at we want to restrict Muslims' freedoms. But it's still so interesting to make this proposition in a political point of view that they do this time after time. So I think changing this view in the society, so political parties can't gain by promoting like anti-Muslim sentiments. But how do you do that? I don't know. But I think that is the thing that must be done.
I tend to agree with you, Ulf, on the need to really change people's mindsets and attitudes and in society. Because, I mean, laws are good and useful for certain situations, but if you don't have the change on the ground with people's attitudes and ability to look at others as human beings and accept them, then the problems are just going to morph and turn into something else, right? And so, you know, I know that, you know, Sweden, and I guess to a shorter extent of time, Denmark has welcomed or has accepted immigrants, and yet oftentimes those immigrants, especially those who come from Muslim majority countries, aren't really well integrated, right? They're not, and there's all kinds of issues and problems with the policies around integration in those countries. So given that there isn't a very clear path forward for immigrants to become part of society, it becomes a little unclear for me to where the change can happen, right? Because I do think it would happen or should happen on an interpersonal level, right? It needs to come from humans interacting with other humans and seeing them as, you know, very simplistically, but as people to learn about. But without that curiosity and without those opportunities, if we keep ghettoizing in our various kinds of different ways, people from other countries, then it's going to be harder and harder to have them be part of the community and have them be understood, you know, as you know. And so so I'm just sort of thinking out loud about some of the challenges, and I don't know what you see, or either one of you actually see in terms of your own experiences. What are some of the ways that these kinds of challenges can be overcome? And because this is universal, I mean, it's happening here too, right? It's happening in Canada, it's happening all throughout Europe.
I mean, so this is sort of I mean, I don't know how interested webinar listeners are in Canadian politics, but here's an analogy to Canada. If you think that this is of deep disinterest, you could just cut me off. But here's the thing about Canada. Canada's got some strengths and some weaknesses. But one of the things it's done for the last 50 years is explicitly target high-skilled migrants. This has been extraordinarily successful for the Canadian economy. And in the 1980s, along with doing this, the Canadian government ran a sort of series of public service announcements that all had the format like this, you know, this person, a racialized person, this person has come to Canada, she's decided to be a doctor, she's serving marginalized communities, isn't this wonderful? This person has come to Canada, he's a nurse, he's contributing to this hospital in this part of Canada. These people have come from this country, they've opened this restaurant which hires this many people and given 47 Canadians jobs, this kind of thing. And it wasn't, I mean, for those of us who study this, it's like, it's obvious what's happening here. It's over the top, it's sort of pro-immigrant attitude shaping. But the result is, the result of these two sort of simultaneous policies is real, which is that Canadians, compared to other OECD countries, display a greater openness to immigrants, a greater openness to refugees, a greater willingness to welcome people who are of different racial, religious, cultural communities. And the explanation is twofold. One, that immigrants to Canada are typically not low income, they're typically high income. So the narrative that immigrants or refugees are taking the welfare state policy, taking advantage of welfare state policies, has simply not been able to emerge because there is no empirical evidence suggesting the truth of that. And the second, sort of the public service announcement version of it was to say, look, people who come from different countries, what do we know of them? They're different. And Lisa, I think you're right. People have to have sort of a curiosity, a willingness to learn. But if they're scared, and they might be, because difference is scary, it can be, you have to take that seriously. Like, take it seriously that people have this sort of reaction that they prefer to be with people who are like them in general. And take it seriously, don't belittle them. give them information that they need so that they can change their minds. And so these public, I mean, back when you couldn't stop advertisements or like watch Netflix, so you never saw them, the government had ways to sort of shape attitudes, public opinions, and it did that. And so, I mean, you know, what's my moral of the story? Everybody should move to Canada. But short of that, then I think like countries, the Nordic countries have to do, I think this is what Lisa was prompting you, Ulf, to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that we need to take seriously that integration is something that is done by the host country, right? I mean, why are people ghettoized? Why are people segregated? Why are people struggling in the job market? It's not because they come without skills. It's not because they come without a willingness to integrate. The Qur'an burners are portraying that as though Muslims come and don't want to integrate, as though they come and they want to be in separate schools, but that's not what folks want when they move. When people move, they want to be part of the new country. They want to eat, I don't know, what's the Swedish food? Is Swedish meatballs? Is that really a thing? I don't even know. They want to eat meatballs with the other Swedish people. They want to, sorry, I don't know very many stereotypes about Nordic people. They can make a Lego joke about the Danes. Yeah. Right. So I think to the extent that there's anti-immigrant sentiment in Sweden, it's the Swedish government's fault. And it should take a more active role in trying to shape positive opinions about newcomers, but it also needs to focus more seriously on the effective settlement of newcomers into the country. Similarly with Denmark, I mean, which is a whole history of actually keeping religions separate. And is now witnessing the effects of keeping people separated, which is that they don't understand each other, they hate each other, they have difficulties integrating with each other in public space. So I think the answer to Lisa's question, which is like, I'm glad I'm not in charge, so I don't have to make this happen. But the answer is the Swedish government, the Danish government needs to take seriously, much more seriously than it has been, the integration of immigrants into their country. Why doesn't that Iraqi guy know Swedish? Maybe there weren't free Swedish lessons. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know anything about Sweden. I'm sure it's delightful. Right? But like that's my feeling is that when these kinds of divisions happen between immigrants and non-immigrants, it's the fault of the hosting state.
Yeah, and the irony too is a lot of these countries, you know, like many of the Nordic countries, the US, I mean, there is there's a population decline, right? Especially among working age people. And so without immigrants, you know, on a very practical level, right, it's going to be harder and harder. So it does make sort of very logical sense to change attitudes in order to change policies as well, and make it easier for immigrants so that there isn't this huge gulf in experience and opportunities. Yeah. So Ulf, I'm sorry, we started critiquing
yes, but
societies, but
this was really good what Patti said, and what we can see right now in Sweden is that the government doing exactly the opposite and trying to make it as hard as possible to integrate in the Swedish society, and trying to have all the rhetoric is about that it's the immigrants that has to change to be accepted into Sweden.
Right.
So even if we know how to do it, it's like very difficult to make it happen. And I think also that it's the media climate is like very difficult to work in also, because right now, like the most important domestic issue we have in Sweden is violence between criminal gangs that are extremely both terrible and extremely affecting our society. And this becomes in the media a question about immigration, and because the leader of one gang is from Turkey, and then everybody presumes he's a Muslim as well. So then it's like immigration becomes like the problem in every problem we have in Sweden right now, due to like how it's portrayed in the media, but also how the political particular politicians choose to address the issues. Then, of course, it's like very easy to say that it's like terrible in Sweden also for immigrants, but in the same way, it's like right now the immigrants in Sweden have one of the highest employment rates in Europe. Muslims in Sweden have a religious freedom that they can't meet in almost no other country in the world. And so they are really free, but also it's like it's a layer of hatred that is also present in society all the time. If you are like a woman that is wearing a veil, you can't be safe for getting some critique on the subway or everyday saying stuff. So it's like there's a very mixed bag of how the situation is really in Sweden.
We have, I just wanted to make note of the time. We have only about 15 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions coming in, so I'm going to take a quick look at those. And I'm wondering, we started talking about immigration, and that is clearly one aspect of this, and the way in which immigrants are treated, especially those coming from Muslim countries. And so it's hard, it's impossible to unentangle that from this discussion at all. I think one thing that I would like to just go back to really quickly, and maybe Patti, you have some things, you have some thoughts on this, but one of the questions is how does it make sense for a secular democracy to have what really appears to be a blasphemy law? I mean, is this completely and to me it doesn't make sense. Could you speak to that a little bit?
I can try. I mean, I think your intuition is right, which is that it feels and is anti-democratic to have blasphemy laws, although not actually because they're laws that restrict the burning of religious texts in particular, but because of, and this was in the Shuddhashar editorial, so I'm just repeating the view that I read there, which is that it's that one thing that you have when you adopt any type of law restricting speech is you have two, actually you generate two democratic dangers. One is that it will be used more liberally than it was intended, right? What we're trying to do is restrict the freedom of hate-filled Qur'an burners, but the law is written in such a way that many other actions, many other people might fall into that. So you would catch people, as it were, that you didn't mean to catch, with rendering their actions legal when you didn't mean to. You run into all kinds of problems of hypocrisy and arbitrary application of law there. And then the next problem that you have is the ways in which these laws single out religious people as though religious people are somehow incapable or unavailable to participate in democratic conversations, right? We need to engage in the restriction of people who are hateful towards religion because people who practice religion are somehow unable to take criticism. This is also not true, right? So it generates all kinds of sort of like unintended consequences, which are just not appropriate in democratic spaces, all of which have to do with the restriction of speech or the implications about the people who are being protected, and so on. And so, so when I read, I guess, Ulf, I wonder if this is your interpretation also. I figured that what the Danish government was doing by adopting this so-called blasphemy law is avoiding doing the difficult work of integration. Right. So it's got a problem. And rather than fix the problem, it's going to distract. It's got a great moment in which it can sort of adopt a law, an anti-blasphemy law. It looks like it's protecting Muslims, looks like it's doing something. And anyway, the only people who are impacted are people that everybody hates anyway, which are these sort of provocateurs. And in so doing, it can avoid the bigger problems, which is what are the source of Islamic sentiments in Denmark? Where are they coming from? And what should the Danish government do, actually be doing as a matter of policy to help them? So I guess I think I got all kinds of problems with blasphemy laws in democratic states, some of which are related to religion, some of which are related to democratic speech, and some of which are just related to the way in which they're distracting from the real problems on the ground. And I think deliberately.
I think when it comes to the Danish law, the politicians there in Denmark, their main goal is actually to please the international audience, because they think that this situation hurts their economic relations with Arabic countries. It becomes difficult to Danish people to travel to these countries and do business, and that is like the most important issue for them. Danish Muslims, I don't think it's their interest at all. So it's really pragmatic point of view from there. They want to like calm the situation on the international level by proposing this law, and hopefully there will like get better relations with foreign nations in this way. But then the law, because the law is like very problematic, and it's a lot of Danish artists and writers that is now protesting against them, because they see that like this, their freedom will be restricted. And it's even if the law have the intentions to like protect Danish Muslims, it's not even clear that it will, because I think it will be like now it will be a new border that provocateurs will test and find out what is allowed, and maybe there will go a new wave of expressions in Denmark with a new law, trying to figure out what is possible to do with the new law.
I want to share a couple of comments from Peter Hervik, who's a Danish scholar. He's written for Shuddhashar before. He's done a lot of work on the political right and media in Denmark. So I'm going to share and sort of read out loud what some of the comments that he made. He says this to all of us, but this first part specifically to you, Ulf. But he says, forget talk about political parties and individual book burners. There is a huge anti-Muslim voting population, a large majority, who support the freedom to burn the Qur'an, but not supporting the crazy individual known burners. Public burning of the Qur'an is an incitement of hatred, which is already not allowed. So Qur'an burning could be stopped and not being a blasphemy issue, which it sounds like something that we're seeing or trying to tease out also, right? Is that you think that there could be another way to do this besides having a blasphemy law per se. And then he continues, freedom of speech could be upheld if the police didn't spend enormous resources on safeguarding the Qur'an burners. That's a good twist. And then Danish nationalism is being built as the mirror opposite of what Danish dislike and even hate, as in Muslims. It is born out of the marriage of the political field and news media. So that's not easy to change. And remember that there are already limitations on free speech. So some useful thoughts from our Danish colleague who's been working on these issues also quite a bit.
Can I actually comment on point number 3?
Mhm.
So I'm not familiar with the scholar because I'm not familiar with Danish nationalism and the literature that comes out of here. So I apologize for that, Peter. But I'm interested in your comment number 3 with respect to the way in which freedom of speech might be upheld if the police didn't spend money on safeguarding the Quran burning. I mean, this is what is so interesting about the Swedish case, is that in order to burn the Quran in a public space, you have to apply for a permission, right? Lisa, you said this in your introductions. I mean, the strangest part of this whole story is that it looks like in giving permission to book burners that the Swedish state is actually sanctioning book burning, which is, it's not, I think it's probably not sanctioning it. What it's sanctioning is what it's trying to do is allow for the maximal use of freedom of speech, but keep some control on it. So I guess the question for Peter, I mean, it's a webinar format, so you'll have to type it back into the website in order to, I think, on Facebook in order for me to see the response. But I'm quite interested in this question of whether what actually should have happened is that the when the Quran burners applied to the Swedish police for permission, the police said no. They said it was a security issue, right? So it wasn't like the police were like, let's just cancel this. Let's just not do it, not spend our money. But having agreed that they're allowed to do it, then you end up having to spend a lot of money to protect those people and to protect the situation, right? And so it's like, I mean, I know that the court overturned it on the grounds of freedom of speech, something which I happen to support. But I'm interested in this sort of like series of events, and what it would mean to say, like, what else could the government, how would the government be protecting freedom of speech by denying the right of the of these guys to burn their books?
But the law in Sweden is say that you don't have to apply to the police for burning the Quran. You can go and do it in the street, everywhere, every time. But if there are a riot against you, there will be no police protecting you. So if you apply for it, the police can then evaluate the situation beforehand and say, okay, we may interpret it that it may be a riot against you. So then we will be at the place there and stop anti-protests. So it actually is that you apply for if there are like disturbance of the public space during the manifestation, the police will see that your free speech can continue and not be stopped by anti-protests. And then the police can say no only if they can't see that they can maintain the order at this time and space that you ask to have your manifestation. And then they can change, okay, they can change the time and change the place if they think that this will be easier for them to maintain public order. So, and then of course, for the people that want to provoke reactions, they have found out that this is a very good tool for them, because then they can make an application and write that they will burn the Quran, and then the newspaper journalist will find that out and write about it, and they will come to these manifestations and it will be broadcasted, and there will be anti-demonstrations that know of this beforehand, and they will come there and start a riot. So it's like a system that makes it very public in a way. Even if because if you decide to just go out and burn the Quran and don't tell it about it, then nobody will be there and see what you have done.
Fascinating. It's like the effects just become enormous, right? From
yes.
You know,
but of course,
if
this is of course an important legislation, or from the important to have this in all other type of political manifestations that should be possible to do in a public square. Because if we didn't have this police protection, then people could just come there and shout higher and scream and bully you until you leave the public space.
Mhm. 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 Right, right. And that is a good point. And then the question is there another way in which, certain kinds of actions can be circumscribed, and not given that space, not given that the attention that it then end up getting, especially when it has effects across the world, right? And I mean, it has effects in the Muslim majority countries, of course.
Yes, but that's also say if you have people that have had to leave Bangladesh because they don't have free speech, and they want to make a manifestation outside the Bangladesh embassy in Stockholm to protest against that.
Mhm.
That, of course, can make the Bangladeshi authorities very upset.
Mhm.
But we must protect that in Sweden, even if there are just people coming to Sweden to make these manifestations.
Yes. I totally I agree, and I'm just glad you mentioned that, because I also recognize that we're out of time. And one of the points that I want to make sure that we underscored was that we earlier talked about immigrants and the ways in which they have faced the brunt of a lot of this, and the way that they have a lot of the negative attitudes and hatred that's been expressed through various actions has been directed toward them. Among those who come from Muslim majority countries, many of them are coming to elsewhere, Nordic countries and other places, because of the restrictions they faced back home, right? And so I do also worry about that also, right? That a blasphemy law, in a sense, is not freeing for the people who had to leave a country that had blasphemy laws or other kinds of legal restrictions. And so I think there's a tendency to lump people into a camp, that they don't all belong. They're not all the same, obviously. And we know that, of course, but it's oftentimes, it's easy to forget when we think about immigrants from Muslim majority countries. We assume that they have similar views from each other. So we do need to stop, because it is time to stop. And I am really delighted that we have had this conversation. I don't think we've answered any questions with any full satisfactory answers that will change the world and change Sweden or Denmark or any of our other countries that we're in. But I feel like I certainly have understood the nuances behind some of these laws and the challenges around them much better. And I very much appreciate your contributions, Patti and Ulf. And I'm glad to have had this opportunity to have this conversation with you both. And thank you all to the audience, and we're very appreciative that you have come and joined us for our very first webinar. And we look forward to seeing you again another time. With many thanks.